What I'm about to disclose here is highly confidential information. I didn't want to tell anybody. Who knows what people might hear about this and jeopardize everything I've tried to keep secure. But in the end, I decided that there are good people who have a right to know. They need to know the truth. First and foremost, my background. I'm Dr. Andrew Thompson, anthropologist, primatologist, and animal behaviorist. I've dedicated my life's work to studying and protecting the great apes. My work had begun in Sierra Leone in the mid-90s, where I had studied and recorded the tool use behavior and cultural transmission of chimpanzees. The focus of this research being to better understand the evolution of society in non-human primates. We tend to think a lot of the time that we came from chimps, but this isn't the case, as chimps themselves have had their own evolutionary history parallel to ours. One of my hopes was that my work in the region would help dispel this common myth. My later work would deal with gorillas within Central Africa, as well as orangutans in Southeast Asia. Wildlife conservation would be another large part of my career. I've been part of several anti-poaching units in the DRC and Uganda, and reforestation efforts in such places like Thailand and Malaysia. While my expertise is mostly in primates, I've had some experience with other varieties of wildlife in the past. Elephants in Cambodia and bottlenose dolphins in the Caribbean, just to name a few. Unfortunately, it hasn't been without its downside. I've witnessed, in my time working in these countries, some intense, gut-wrenching sights, many of which are still difficult for me to think back to, particularly what I saw in Borneo. I remember coming across an entire acre of bulldozed land, once thriving forest, cut down for palm oil plantations. The worst of it, a lone female orangutan was seen desperately clinging to a lone tree, terrified after losing her home. The scene had brought me to tears, having just been served a taste of the scale of destruction human greed was capable of. To this day, the memory plays on a loop in the back of my mind. Despite everything I'd see throughout the years working in the field, however, I had found something far more serious, more intense than practically anything I've been able to handle. I mean this when I say it. If I wasn't there to witness everything for myself, I would have dismissed it all as fantastical bullshit. But no, I know what I endured, and it changes just about everything I ever thought I knew. The situation began in the early month of December, nearly 2 years ago. I had just gotten back from a field study in the DRC, assessing the impact of civil unrest on critically endangered western lowland gorillas. It was late in the evening when I had received a sudden and peculiar email from a Nepalese NGO. It read the following: Dr. Thompson, we are aware of your work with non-human primates. It has come to our knowledge that local settlements within a remote part of the Himalayas have been reporting sightings of a large, unidentified mammal. Descriptions have ranged from small, dog-sized animals to much larger and more bear-like in demeanor. This section of the Himalayas is very poorly studied, and much is still not known of what wildlife frequents the area. We are offering you to come and assist in a survey and assessment of the area's mammalian fauna, and hope you could help determine the identity of these creatures via retrieval of genetic material, camera traps, and other methods necessary. Please let us know your response later this week. Regards, Himalayan Nature Fund. Immediately I had several questions. First, who is this NGO? I haven't heard of a Himalayan Nature Fund prior, and even more odd, couldn't find any results when I tried looking them up. Perhaps they were a relatively new organization. Second, where exactly was this site of study? The email didn't specify where in the Himalayas this would take place. Perhaps they wanted to await my answer beforehand. Finally, the issue at hand. Why on earth would they want me of all people? Most of my studies have pertained to great apes and other primates. While some species do occur in the Himalayas, I didn't really feel like I was the right person for the job. In normal circumstances, I'm usually happy to assist in wildlife-based research, even that which doesn't exactly pertain to primates. Here, however, it just didn't make sense as to why they would ask me to assist them. Then there's the question of whether or not some of the sightings described in the email may perhaps refer to a previously undiscovered species. In several cases, this was definitely a possibility, in particular the Amazon rainforest. The Himalayas, however, didn't seem like one of those potential cases. Even with its sparse population and high inaccessibility, I thought about the offer long and hard that night. I was somewhat suspicious of this NGO, an organization, one which lacks a website or any internet mention, just suddenly reaching out to me. The next day I responded to them. Before I can accept your offer, I will need to know more about your organization. Much to my surprise, it only took a few hours for them to return my email. I was shown a location via satellite map. It was accompanied by this message: "We are a relatively recent non-profit organization and our base of operations is in Kathmandu. We have a base set up in our area of study at the edge of the national park Sagarmatha. It is there where the survey will be conducted." While this more so convinced me, I was still having plenty of personal doubts, but at the same time, there was something that was reeling in my curiosity. Ultimately, in the end, I decided to put my suspicions aside and accepted the offer. The following week, I flew into Nepal. When I arrived at the international airport at Kathmandu, the first thing I had to do was to deal with customs. Being that I was in a foreign country, once customs had been taken care of, I headed outside to look for the people who invited me here. At first, I couldn't seem to find anybody, despite the place being moderately crowded. I wandered aimlessly for several minutes. Then a voice called out to me, "You there?" I turned to see a middle-aged man in khakis and a white polo shirt. Definitely someone very out of place. "You must be Dr. Thompson." I replied. "Are you from the NGO that hired me?" "Sure am. Name's James Welker. I'm chairman of Himalayan Nature Fund. Come, we've got quite a lot to discuss. I'll tell you on the way." This didn't feel right to me. It was astoundingly bizarre to me that an American citizen of all people would be running a Nepalese-based organization, specifically one that deals in environmental preservation. As I followed Welker, he led me to a helicopter out on the runways, presumably the method of transport to our base of operations in the mountains. "We're not driving there?" I asked. "Nope. The area is pretty remote. Gonna have to fly in." Without further questions, the two of us boarded and took off. As we ascended, the mountainous onlook of the Himalayas below came into view, all of it against the backdrop of none other than Mount Everest. The mountain was so massive, it could be seen from where we were. I still had several questions, and since Welker and I were both wearing headsets, we could converse. "So why did you want me for this?" "You see, your work with apes and monkeys captured my fancy. Figured I need you and your skills for a research expedition I'm doing," I was told as we flew. "To my knowledge, there aren't many primate species found here. Given what you've described in the email, the animals seem too big to be either species of the monkeys that occur this region." He turned to look at me for a second. "Well, that's not what the eyewitnesses were saying. Couple mountain villages had people saying they absolutely saw something ape-like." What he said next, I wasn't sure what to make of it. Just maybe it's a Yeti these folk have been seeing. He chuckled and turned his attentions back toward the horizon, seemingly cracking a joke. Most kids grow up believing in Santa before understanding reality. For me, however, it was cryptids. Creatures like Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and of course the Yeti. My younger self always cherished the idea of there being large, undiscovered creatures that have evaded detection and scientific study. As I got older, however, I began to understand the logic of ecology and improbability of cryptids. While it's true some turned out to be real and are now well known by the scientific community, like the Okapi and Komodo dragon, the majority of cryptids simply just don't make sense, both practically and ecologically. Simple sightings and eyewitness accounts are for the most part unreliable and not very accurate, and hard evidence such as hair, scat, and skeletal remains are almost always absent or misidentified. In the case of the Yeti, there have been alleged hair samples collected, but most of them were either lost or were found to belong to other animals. Sightings may simply be misidentifications of either brown or black bears, both of which are found in this region in the form of their respective Himalayan subspecies. Nearly an hour later, we landed at the camp set up at the base of the valley, all of it in the shadow of Everest. As I exited the helicopter, I arrived at 2 large safari tents set up by a riverside. Once more, something was off. Where were the other people? As I wondered, out of one of the tents came a woman, middle-aged and steely-eyed. She focused her sights on me and pointed. "You there? You the scientist we hired?" Yes. "Where are my manners?" James said. "Dr. Thompson, I'd like you to meet my wife, Vic." She was apparently the only other person present aside from me and James. Why didn't they at least have 1 or 2 more people on this supposed research expedition? So if I'm correct, it's just the 2 of you here? I asked. 3, now that you're here, James replied. "Well, alright then, but if I may ask, don't you need more people for these kinds of scientific excursions?" James looked at me and grinned. "All we really need is a qualified scientist. That's where you come in," he replied. "It's getting dark. Let's get a flame going so we can discuss what we'll be doing in terms of research." I followed James and his wife to a fire pit. After we got a flame burning, he sat around to discuss just what kinds of scientific activity we would be doing in the area. "So what exactly are we doing in terms of anything scientific?" I asked. "Glad you asked," James said enthusiastically. "This particular area hasn't been very well studied or documented in terms of what kinds of wildlife regularly occurs here. Of course, you probably know that from the email you got. Been getting a good amount of local eyewitness accounts describing what they're certain is some large gorilla-like creature, which is where you come in. We were hoping you could help us find out whether it's a known species or something entirely new." From the way he described it, this seemed like an excuse to go searching for the Yeti. As I was somebody grounded in scientific reality, to me, expeditions intended to search for cryptids were nothing short of a waste of time and money. There was just no point in trying to search for an animal whose existence has no scientific evidence backing it. Was I seriously dragged halfway around the world to South Asia for this? James then continued. "Got 2 camera traps it's set up at different ends of the valley. Should help us find what kinds of animals are harder to spot. Gonna head out to check the first one tomorrow. Let's get some shut-eye for now though." Just like that, my briefing was wrapped up. Simply the details and goal of the expedition, and that was it. The longer I was here, the more doubtful I was becoming of their so-called organization. Simply the fact that their prescience online was virtually non-existent. And now the fact that I may have just been duped into chasing a non-existent animal. Regardless, I had no choice at this point but to go with it. Before I left for my tent, James stopped me for a quick second. "Oh, and one more thing. It's important I mention it to you." "What would that be?" I asked. "Don't enter my wife and his tent when we're not inside. It's an issue pertaining to privacy that we have," Vic explained. "If we are present inside, be sure to let us know you need to discuss something before we let you in," she added. "It's a given that you don't enter somebody's quarters when they're not around." It felt odd to me that they would feel the need bring it up. Not only that, they seemed unusually serious about the matter. "Understood," I said in response. I proceeded to my tent, looking forward to getting a decent 8-hour night of sleep after the production of a day I'd had. I began wondering just how I ended up agreeing to all of this in the first place. They may have not flat out stated it, but there's no hiding the fact that these 2 are merely attempting to find a Yeti. I figured, however, that this could simply be a chance to definitively show these people that such an animal couldn't and never did exist, so I decided to humor them for the time. When I got to my tent though, I started to gain a feeling of unease. I didn't know why at the moment, but I just had some instinctual feeling, as if someone was spying on our campsite. I looked around at the horizon in all directions, but saw nothing but the surrounding valley and peaks. I stood there for a good minute, just frozen in place before entering. As soon as I was inside, I headed off to sleep. The next morning, I got up and got into some warm clothes. I left my tent to go find James, but he was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he was still in his tent, which led me to go check. When I got there, there seemed to be silence from the inside. Were they maybe still asleep? Remembering what James said last night, I knew better than to pull the curtain door to the side without letting them know first. Vic had said to let them know last night when I was outside their tent. I decided to call to them, but before I could, a hand touched my shoulder, frightening me. Whoa, easy partner, no need to get all crazy. It was James. He had just appeared out from behind me. Where he had come from, I honestly hadn't the slightest idea. Where were you? I asked. Just taking care of something, he replied. Despite me not knowing what that something was. In spite of my confusion, however, I decided now wasn't the perfect time to ask him about it, and shifted the subject to the camera trap we were supposed to check today. So, how far is the first one? I asked. About an hour and a half hike along the mountainside. Had it positioned on a tree about halfway up. Should have caught a good amount of stuff passing through last night. He seemed confident in his assumption. The only way to find out though was to go and see for ourselves. Well, let's get a move on. Complying with James, the two of us set out onto the trail. The two of us set out into the north end of the valley, beginning a long, strenuous hike up the mountain. The first part of the trek took us through dense forests of pine. The calls of assorted birds could be heard echoing through the woods. At one point, the two of us stopped at the sound of high-pitched chirping noise. Not from a bird, however. The sound had come from a small mammal up above in the canopy, which I could just barely spot as a tiny, orange blur from below. Thankfully, I had binoculars on me, and only after using them could I make out its identity. The animal was a red panda, an endangered species resembling a raccoon with reddish fur. We were incredibly lucky to have seen one, as it's believed there are only a few thousand individuals left in the Asian wilderness, with hardly more than several hundred in Nepal. Proceeding from the encounter, the two of us continued onward. As we increased in elevation, trees began to appear less numerous. The higher you go, the shallower the mountain's soil gets. Just a bit further and we should be there, James told me for reassurance. The two of us now traversed the side of the mountain, rock wall and snow on one side, a panoramic view of the Himalayas on the other. Above it all towered Everest, which dwarfed all the other surrounding peaks on the horizon. We hiked for what seemed like another hour up the steep terrain, and I was becoming exhausted. I was soon to be in luck, however, as we had finally reached the site of the first camera trap. It was set on a pine tree within a small ravine. There was a spring as well, which provides necessary water for thirsty animals at this altitude. Time to see what we've caught so far, James said as he began to remove the device from the pine bark. Once we set it down, we opened it up and began going through the images. A good chunk of images were of smaller mammals, such as marmots and pikas, both of which are adapted to living at such high elevation. Himalayan tahr, a species of wild goat, was also frequently caught passing through, suggesting a relatively healthy population in the area. To confirm this, however, the other traps would need to be checked. Less frequently caught were carnivores. There were several instances of yellow-throated marten passing by, which despite their size, are fierce predators capable of taking down prey much heavier than themselves. Out of the hundreds of photos that were shot of passing wildlife, at least 2 of them managed to capture snow leopards. Their shy behavior and rarity in the wild has made it difficult for researchers to study them, and we were fortunate just to have seen them on these photos given their elusiveness. Finally, it was seemingly confirmed what I suspected all along. Several images of black bears were snapped wandering through the site. One in particular showed one standing on its hind legs. When viewed from a distance, this can most certainly appear as a large and human-like creature. I hadn't a doubt in my mind that this was what eyewitness accounts were describing. "Looks like we've solved your primate mystery," I said to him. His face started to grin in response to what I said. "That may be, but we ain't done just yet." He was right. We still had to check the rest of the traps and analyze our data, although something about his response was quite unsettling. After I had put the camera trap away, the two of us began heading down the mountain from whence we came. Going down from where we came was far easier than the walk up. Everything was, quite literally, downhill. It didn't take long for us to reach the dense, canopy-shaded forests lower down the mountain, though when we did, our path was obstructed. On the trail we came from, there was a fallen tree. I don't know, but somehow it must have fallen while James and I were up at the camera site. As I went over to investigate it, I turned my attention to the stump it broke off of. Nothing the soil around the roots seemed to be intact. Whatever the reason this tree fell, it couldn't have been erosion. When I looked back towards the fallen log, something else caught my eye. There were these markings in the tree. It's normal for some animals to occasionally make claw or bite marks into bark, be it for feeding, climbing, or various other uses. However, these weren't indicative of claw marks. They were carefully cut and organized into a particular shape. A sort of V-shape with the end of the lines on both sides protruding outwards and a straight, horizontal line midway down the lines. The shape it all made resembled a tar, much like the ones we saw on the trap photos. This wasn't even the oddest thing. I looked down below and saw a relatively thin piece of triangular stone with sharp edges. There's no mistake, the tree falling and the markings both were man-made. I was well aware of local Sherpa settlements in and around the Sagarmatha area, but it wasn't in my knowledge that they made markings like this. Before I could say anything else, James insisted we continue back to base. He started to climb over the fallen log. I took the stone I found and stuffed it into my bag before following him. After about 35 minutes, we reached the valley floor, forest giving way to meadows and shrub. Base was about another 15 to 20 minutes away, but now that we were on flat ground, it wouldn't be as exhausting. Once more, something had my attention, but not visually this time. I caught a pungent smell from the air while we walked through the alpine meadows. It was a scent I was, to my misfortune, all too familiar with. A vulture unexpectedly swooped over our heads, nearly causing me to topple over face forward. In the direction it was headed in, there seemed to be a something on the side of a small stream. Above, more vultures seemed to be circling around something. There was apparently something dead in that spot. Unable to determine what it was, I walked over slowly to get a better look. I approached slowly as to not cause a commotion with the scavengers, and when I did, dozens of them were feeding on and fighting over scraps of meat. Despite this, I could confirm the carcass belonged to a tar, only something was wrong. At first, I thought maybe this was a snow leopard kill, but that idea was off the table immediately once I noticed the animal's head was missing. There wasn't a doubt in my mind that this was the work of poachers. In my days working with anti-poaching patrols in Central Africa, I've seen an horrific amount of mutilated animals. Seeing slain elephants beheaded for their tusks was some of the most gut-wrenching things I've ever had to look at. This brought back every feeling of disgust and dread I had felt back then. Could the people in question have been responsible for what we saw in the forest as well? The carvings on the tree could have been made there as a way to mark a hunting spot. James was looking around at the tar, shaking his head slowly in a state of discontent. He seemed to be deep in thought. This isn't good. If there are poachers in this area, then this likely hasn't been their only kill. He looked concerned, but was hesitant. We have to report this as soon as we can. My wife and I will radio the parks department first thing tomorrow. Waiting wasn't an option. Any delay meant buying time for the poachers. No, as soon as we return, we needed to get in contact with them as quickly as possible. And we will, he said. I promise you first thing in the morning my wife and I will get in touch with them. Without saying anything else, he started back towards camp. Contacting the department at the soonest possible time was the best and most reasonable option. James seemed rather hesitant to do it right away. Too tired to question it further, I proceeded after him. Upon arrival back at base, Vic emerged from her and James's tent. You boys seem like you've had quite the day. We retrieved the camera, but on the way down we came across a headless tar. It was more than likely poached. I explained the situation. Vic's eyes seemed to widen in somewhat a state of surprise. Oh, that seems awful now. James intervened. Come, hun. I'll discuss everything with you inside. You've had quite the lengthy day. It's best you hit the sack for tonight. I don't think I should. It's best we take shifts in case the poachers move through this area. No need, James replied. We don't know where they'll set foot next. There's no point to standing around in the cold all night expecting them. His logic and reasoning were shoddy, but he seemed firm about it. We need rest up for tomorrow. That includes you. Now go get some sleep. Before I could say anything else, the two of them returned to their tent. Unable to follow them, I headed back to mine. As I laid down on my bed, I pulled out the stone tool from earlier. This is allegedly what the poachers may have used to create the markings on the log. Looking at it, I noticed something, particularly the shape of the edges. The stone I held was flaked, shaped by striking another stone against it. Who made this tool? Where did the poachers get it? Why would they use this to make markings as opposed to a legitimate knife? These were just some of the questions I kept asking myself as I slowly fell asleep. I was woken up in the middle of the night by a sound, one that seemingly echoed throughout the valley, accompanied by the blowing of the Himalayan winds. What the hell was that? I thought to myself. The call was haunting, subtle, and melancholy, yet also incredibly loud, definitely coming from something large. There was no animal local to this region that I knew could make such vocalizations. However, there was something about it, like I've heard it somewhere before. I exited my tent, scanning the horizon around me. There was no sign of any animal nearby. In fact, the area around the base was devoid of any activity. Not only that, but aside from the sound of the wind, it was all silent. The calls I heard, I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but I've heard vocalizations exactly like it before. Then, several feet away from my tent, I noticed something. There was a bizarre pile of stones. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but there were several large stones placed beside each other in what appeared to be a circle. When I looked to see what was in the middle, my eyes parted open like blinds receding above a windowsill. It was the other camera trap. Or at least the box the camera is held in. The actual camera was nowhere to be seen. This had to be the work of the poachers. They must have stumbled upon it and stolen it so that any evidence of their presence could be covered up. Why they would place those stones around it was unclear to me, however. I knew there was no way in hell I could just ignore this. I returned to my tent, got into proper hiking gear, and set out to retrieve the camera. Against my better judgment, I decided not to wake James and Vic. I thought it was best maybe I could locate the poachers' trail and then return to wake them up and let them know. I wandered out into the direction I believed these people had wandered off into, armed only with a flashlight. The light I shined in front of me only revealing the dense bushes and trees in the way. It was irritating to have to push all of that foliage to the side, but it also made me somewhat nervous. Anything could simply jump out at any moment, including the poachers in question. Because of this, I had to be alert. I traversed deeper into the woods, gaining more elevation as I did. Finally, the beam of my flashlight shined onto some tracks. I was several feet away but was certain these were recent. I approached them to get a better look, but when I did, that's when things started getting, well, rather abnormal. For starters, the tracks were barefoot. I was able to make it out as soon as I was close enough. They were also rather large, and I'm not talking about just some guy having large feet. These were at least the size of a grizzly bear's hind foot. Lastly, the toe prints didn't even look human. There seemed to be a massive gap between the largest toe and the rest of them, which was a recognizable shape in chimpanzees and gorillas, but it didn't make a glimmer of sense. Before I could question it any further, off in the distance, I could hear the sound of a tree falling. It seemed at least half a mile away, but near enough for me to just faintly hear it. My sense of caution was temporarily replaced with confusion and fear, but at the same time, I was somewhat curious. Without thinking it though, I made my way towards the source of the sound. Making my way slowly through the bushes, more tracks became visible within along the trail. It was clear these were made quite possibly minutes ago. I started following one set, but it ended at the face of a boulder. As I pointed my flashlight upward, the beam revealed not only foot impressions on the rock wall that stood before me, but massive handprints as if someone, or more likely something, was climbing up. I didn't have any gear that could help me scale the wall, so I did the next best thing and looked for a way around. Luckily, there was a thin tract of ground, not too steep, but just even surfaced enough for me to walk on it. I crept to the edge of it and climbed to the best of my ability up a small, just barely vertical surface. With enough effort, I managed to pull myself up. At the cost of expending so much of my strength, I nearly passed out on the ground. After taking a good 5 minutes to catch my breath, I continued following the tracks. When I did, my flashlight revealed the mouth of a cave. I wasn't sure if anything was in there at the moment, or more so what would be in there, but I had a pretty good idea. The worst possible scenario was that this was a bear den, and entering meant a risk of getting mauled. I knew better, I wasn't dumb, yet, despite my knowledge, I had to figure out what the flying fuck was going on and why things were starting to make no damn sense. Regardless of any risk, I entered. When I did, I slowly and quietly crept around, shining my flashlight forward as I descended deeper. The beam shined on the walls of the cave, and what it revealed shocked me even more so. There were chalk engravings of what appeared to be local Himalayan animals. Bears, deer, one of them being a snow leopard. I carefully scanned the cave wall with my light until it shined on a more familiar carving. It was the head of a Himalayan tar, the exact same one James and I came across on the trail yesterday. If this was the work of poachers, why would they go through all the trouble to mark this cave as a hunting spot? It just doesn't add up. My attention soon turned down below as my light revealed more flaked stones, sharpened at the edge. Presumably this is where stones like the one I found were made. Part of me was beginning to think that this couldn't be the work of poachers, but perhaps somebody who once lived here. This, though, wasn't the most surprising thing. When I pointed my flashlight at the far end of the cave, what it revealed baffled me beyond any ability of capable reasoning I had. Yet another rock circle, this time much wider. In the center of it was a large, sharpened branch. Impaled on it, the camera, who or whatever the hell had done this, had a frightening amount of precision and strength. There's no way, nor is there a reason for poachers, if there even are any here, to make this entire scene. From outside the cave, I heard it again. The same sound that woke me up to begin with, only this time, it sounded much closer in proximity to where I was. I had no idea of what to make of this situation anymore, but instinctively I grabbed the camera, or at least what remained of it, and bolted as quickly as I could out of the cave. Once I was outside, I tried to book it back to base. Before I could, however, I could hear a loud crashing sound out in the bushes. Something large was obviously making its way to this spot, but it was too dark for me to see out into the distance. With quick thinking, I nestled my way into some dense bushes, hoping I would stay well hidden. I crouched there, not making so much as a twitch. The only light I could make out was a faint beam shining down from the moon into the clearing where the cave entrance was, and it was in that spot where I saw them. Out of the darkness, a small, dog-sized primate with silvery hair came out on all fours. For a split second, I thought that maybe this was some weird-looking macaque. That idea quickly vanished as soon as I observed it more closely. Its anatomy was way too articulate for any old-world monkey. This was clearly a great ape I was looking at. Preceding were two larger animals, both about as big as a large bear. Their hair was silvery as well, but much longer than the first individual. One of them, the smaller of the two, had a rounded head and a face devoid of any hair. The largest of all three had a patch of hair protruding from its chin like a beard, and had long, flat protrusions to the sides of its face. Suddenly, it stood up on its hind legs, making a soft, rhythmic bellowing. Never would I have thought I, a scientist grounded in reality, would admit to such a statement, but what was standing several feet away was a group of YETI'S. Me, who for a while had logically dismissed cryptids as wild legend and myth, was looking at three of them. Everything I wrote off as a bunch of fantastical bullshit. Was it based on truth all along? It's the only explanation. Why else would there be great apes in the Himalayas? The largest of the three was no doubt a male. The protrusions on the sides of his face, known as flanges, were a dead giveaway. The other two was most likely a female with her infant. As the male stood there, he surveyed the surroundings and then turned to the female, who proceeded to stand upright. What happened next blew me away. Most apes in the wild use posture, facial expressions, vocalizations to communicate. I've observed it many times in gorillas, chimps, and orangutans respectively. I wasn't prepared though for what I was about to witness. The male was moving his hands in particular motions, making several gestures to the female and infant. It didn't take a genius to realize that they were using signs to communicate. Many apes in captivity are capable of learning sign language and have been shown to excel in the use of it. Such usage, however, to my knowledge, has never been recorded in wild non-human primates. Not only was this mind-boggling to behold, but it helped me to connect the dots. The carving on the tree, the flaked stones, the cave markings, the stone circles, it was all the work of the YETI'S. Not only was a seemingly mythical animal very much real, but their behavior and intelligence are apparently on par with early hominins. Responding to the male's sign language, the female and infant entered the cave. The male, however, stayed outside, continuing to keep watch. It didn't take me long to figure out, but I figured this male was protecting his family. He was standing guard outside against any potential danger, which, as I frighteningly realized, may be what I could be perceived as. I knew it was probably for the better that I didn't stick around any longer. Slowly, I backed up, wanting to make as little noise as I could. Unfortunately, I noticed the branch all too late. After stepping on it, the male's attention snapped over in my direction, his bellow becoming a soft but deeper and intimidating growl. He began to walk over to the bushes I was hidden in, and as he did, my heart started to race. I held my breath in out of sheer terror. He stopped right in front of the brush. I could hear his breath and could feel the anger in it. But before anything else could happen, a gunshot was heard echoing out in the distance. He turned his head in response and bolted out into the woods in the direction of the shot. Upon hearing the sound, it resurrected my fears that there was still very much a chance of poachers here. My main concern at the moment though was getting back to base, and the male's diverted attention bought me time to get away. I made my way back downhill as fast as I could, getting whacked in the face with dense foliage multiple times, but urgent to return and inform James and Vic. I wasn't sure how to straight up tell them what I saw, but I was going to try my best to explain. Soon enough, I was back. The first thing I noticed was the lights on in James and Vic's tent. I rushed over there as soon as I could, so see if they were alright, but when I did, the curtains to the tent were wide open. Neither of them was present inside. I looked toward the rest of base to see if they could be anywhere else. "Hello?" I called, hoping they were nearby, but nobody replied. While I did most certainly remember their rule of not entering while they weren't present, I was worried, so I took the risk and went inside. Once I was, things seemed wrong. In the corner there were several firearms against a box of ammunition. Why would an environmental organization have this? I then caught wind of a pungent yet familiar scent coming from a table. It was a cloak, clearly covering something underneath it. I was already pushing it by coming in here unannounced, but I couldn't help but wonder what the hell this was. I lifted the cloak, and I instantly regretted it. It was the severed head of a tar, the reveal of which caused me to jump back and nearly throw up. Why the flying fuck was this in here? As I stood there, terrified and disgusted, a familiar voice broke out from behind me. "Haven't you ever heard of privacy?" I looked to find James standing in the doorway, but rather than looking angry, he had a sinister looking grin on his face. "I figured you'd find out sooner or later." "Hold on," I shouted. "You're the one who killed it." "Course not," he said. "That honor was hers." Vic came into view next to James, holding a rifle in her hands. "You guys," I said stuttering, "you're not an actual organization, are you? Took you long enough to figure it out?" James replied, "My wife and I hunt big game, and we're here to bag a particularly special trophy." Everything had finally came together. The questionable status of their NGO, the dead tar we came across, their reluctance to report it. It all made sense, and I was somehow too dumb to realize any of it. We were out here hunting bears and sheep when we came across them. To think we had a chance to hunt something as rare as that, Vic explained. Spent weeks trying to find them but didn't have us any luck, until we got you over here, that is. I heard them correctly. Not only were they sport hunters posing as environmentalists, but they apparently wanted to hunt and kill a Yeti. "You can't do this," I yelled. "What you're doing is illegal, specifically around a national park." "That's so," James said while chuckling. "It's not illegal if the animal in question doesn't legally exist. I always knew there was something iffy about them, but never expected them to be this deplorable. You, my kind sir, are going to lead us to them," James said. "And what the hell makes you think I'll do that?" Vic cranked her rifle and pointed it at me, showing me that they meant business. "You want to get out of here alive, you listen to us. No questions, no complaints, no shit." Vic then pointed her rifle outward, signaling me to follow. "Come on, time to get going," she said. With no other choice, I complied. We headed out into the woods toward the trail I followed up to the cave. Behind me, Vic held the rifle, loaded with ammunition in case I decided to try and book it. I was once more forced through the bushes and trees uphill, not even stopping to rest for a minute, as they were serious about their motive. I was reluctant about this whole thing, and I wanted to make a break break for it, but knew that if I tried, I was a dead man. We walked for about another 30 minutes, until fortunately the two of them finally decided to stop for a quick minute, but still kept their guard up. James then asked me, "We better be almost there, ain't got a lot of patience left here." I couldn't help it anymore, so I asked, "Why are you doing this? What could you possibly get out of it?" James replied, "Why else? We've bagged just about every kind of big game there is around the globe. But this will be the one to complete it all. Once my wife and I bag ourselves a legend, we ourselves will be legendary ourselves." To think that when I picked up on their intentions to look for a Yeti, I brushed it off as nonsense. But now they were going to shoot not only one, but quite possibly an entire family. Not only the male, but female and infant were in danger as well. They were going to die, and I was the one helping in their demise. Before anything else could be said, an ear-piercing roar could be heard echoing out in the distance. Vic turned to James in response. "What did I tell you, hun? Worth it bringing the snares and all?" No, they had brought traps as well, and it looks like of them had gotten hold. Without any more hesitation, Vic pointed her rifle at me, egging me to go on. We proceeded a good 25 minutes up the mountain, walking through without any stop. Soon we came closer and closer to the sound of more agonizing roars. Suddenly, James and Vic came to a complete stop. The two of them slowly crept through the foliage and peered through the vegetation. There, at the edge of a ravine, was the male Yeti. His foot was caught in a snare as he roared in agonizing pain. "Look at you, more of a beaut than I would have imagined," James said to the animal. It tried to lunge forward at him, but only collapsed in pain as it struggled against the snare. "Here you are, they'd have called us lunatics if we tried telling them, but you're here. And now, you'll complete our collection." Vic then handed him the rifle. "The honor is all yours, hun." James took the gun from her and pointed it at the animal, positioning it so a clean shot could be taken. Before he decided to take it though, he turned to me attempting to reassure me. "Now don't you worry, he won't feel nothing. He'll be dead in a quick second." He turned back to focus on his shot. Here we were, a creature I thought was a bunch of bullshit, about to die at the hands of a big game hunter, the most despicable way for any wild animal to be taken out, and here I was, standing aimlessly, not a damn thing I could do. I looked into the ape's eyes. He was beginning to tire from all the struggling. I could see a look of fear and uncertainty, of wanting to live. What happened next, I just did without thinking, but I decided I couldn't just let this happen. Right as James tried to shoot, I pushed him as hard as I could, causing him to fire upward and miss his kill. We both fell over, James dropping his rifle. The two of us tried to get back up and race to grab it, but both of us got to it at the same time. Things turned into a deadly game of tug of war, each of us trying to pull the gun out of one another's grasp. I started to loose my grip as James pulled against me, knowing what he'll do to me if I let go. I couldn't hold on for much longer, but then I kicked him, the force of which caused me to fall back, but sent James flying over the edge of the ravine. I could hear his scream echo as he fell to his doom. "You fuck," Vic screamed at me as she stormed furiously and quickly over to where I was and picked up the rifle James and I fought over. Without hesitation, she picked up the rifle, cranking it to shoot me. I was seconds away from certain death, but then she was grabbed, picked up from her legs by the Yeti. He proceeded to roar furiously, slamming her on the ground and against the trees, before tossing her over the ravine edge. Just like that, the two of them were gone. Their much-desired trophy now caught in a trap, now helpless to escape. There was something about seeing an animal so large, yet almost human, that simply sends a feeling of sheer terror down one's spine. Not wanting to be next, I made a break for it, running through the dense brush like my life depended on it, though in this case, it quite literally did. But then, without so much as any bit of critical thinking, I stopped. A feeling of guilt started to come over me, realizing leaving the Yeti there just to slowly die was nothing but a cowardly and ill-intentioned move. This wasn't the person I was supposed to be. Deciding that even though it may cost me my life, I went back to free him. When I returned there, he was weak and disoriented, almost devoid of any remaining strength. I walked over to get the snare off, but as I got close, he suddenly lunged at me, roaring in fear and anger. He slammed his fists into the ground and bared his teeth, a long set of canines, as he did. I could see in his eyes pure, unbridled rage, a deep-seated disdain for humanity. Perhaps the reason they've avoided human detection for so long is because of an unfavorable history with us, because we pushed them over the edge, nearly into complete extinction, and forcing them to hide. I couldn't just do nothing, however, so I tried my best to calm him. I used a calm tone of voice and put my hands out, hoping he would interpret it as me trying to show him that I wasn't a threat. I then spoke to him in a calm, reassuring voice. "Please, just stay still, I'm here to help. I'm a friend." It seemed to do the trick. As he stopped going ballistic and started to settle down, the two of us shared a gaze into each other's eyes for a quick second. He began to understand my intentions, that I meant him no harm. Once this was settled, I slowly approached him to remove the snare, but when I did, he started to growl. Once more, I reassured him, doing my best to tell him that I wanted to free him. "Please, I promise I won't hurt you." His growl slowly faded, and I was able to get to his foot, and gently I pinched the cables. This seemed to do it as the snare was loosened enough to allow his foot to go free. Once he was free, he looked at me and stood up on his hind legs. He walked over to me, towering above. At any moment, if he wanted to, he could pick me up and snap me like a twig, but no. We shared a calm, reassuring gaze. The sky on the horizon started to light up as the sun rose behind the backdrop of the mountains. The Yeti looked at me one last time and nodded. It's as if this was his way of telling me, "Thank you." He lumbered off into the woods, back to check in with his family, disappearing into the Himalayan wilderness. While it took me a solid hour, I made my way back to base. Luckily, the helicopter James brought me in was still here. Once I was set to go, I used it to return to Kathmandu. Now I'm here, almost 2 years later, recalling everything that happened. And after all this time, I've come to a decision. I have to go back. In my line of work, I've seen enough destruction, enough death, all of it stemming from human greed, and don't want to see any more fall victim to such. You see, one of the reasons I was so into cryptozoology as a kid was because I wanted to protect the animals it dealt with, assuming they were even real. But now I know one of them, the Yeti, most certainly exists. What about the other cryptids? Were they all real too? One thing that I knew was for certain, James and Vic wouldn't be the last people to come across the Yeti with the worst intentions. More would come for them, more would try to exploit them. Because of this, I've made up my mind. I need to go back and help them. I'm still not sure if I'm right releasing all of this to the public. There's no way of knowing who will see it. As I mentioned before though, I know there are people, good, open-minded people, who will understand. People who know that there are things in this world worth protecting. Thank you to my super fans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacy, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.